I'm Clara, 42 years old, and I've been married for 18 years. I've always been the kind of woman who managed everything, my family, my home, my life. But recently, it feels like everything is on the verge of falling apart. My daughter, Emma, is in her early 20s. She's full of energy, always out with friends or working. Her husband, Mark, is polite, reserved, and respectful, or at least, that's how I used to think of him. But over time, I started noticing subtle things, his lingering glances, the way his eyes seemed to follow me when he thought no one was watching. It was something I didn't want to acknowledge, but I couldn't ignore it. I convinced myself I was overthinking, imagining things. But one afternoon when Emma went out with some friends, it was just Mark and me at the house. The silence was oddly heavy, almost too still. Mark was on the couch, flipping through a magazine, and I went about my usual routine, cleaning, putting dishes away, trying to keep busy. But the tension in the air didn't escape me. It was subtle at first, like the calm before a storm. "Would you like something to drink?" I asked, trying to sound casual as I walked into the living room with a glass of water. Mark looked up, and for a moment his gaze was intense. "A glass of wine would be nice," he said, his voice calm, but with an edge I hadn't noticed before. I hesitated, then nodded. "Sure." I moved toward the kitchen, feeling his eyes on me. The silence felt thick, like something was about to snap. When I returned with the wine, Mark was standing by the window, staring out. "Everything okay?" I asked, trying to hide the nervousness in my voice. He turned to face me, and we stood there for a long moment, just staring at each other. Something about his eyes, it wasn't right. "Yeah, everything's fine," he said, though his eyes told me otherwise. I set the wine down, my hands shaking just slightly. The tension between us was so thick, it felt suffocating. I wasn't sure if I should say something, or if I should just pretend nothing was wrong. But I couldn't ignore the way he was looking at me, as if he was waiting for me to make a move. "Clara," Mark said softly, his voice low, almost hesitant. "I've been meaning to tell you something." My heart raced, and a knot formed in my stomach. I wanted to tell him to stop, to say that this was wrong, that we couldn't do this. But for some reason, I stayed quiet, my breath shallow, as I waited for him to continue. "I've always admired you," he whispered. "From the moment I met you, I couldn't help but feel something." I froze. I knew exactly what he meant. It was in the way he said it, in the way his gaze never left mine. Just as I was about to respond, the doorbell rang, startling us both and breaking the tension. Mark stepped back, and I quickly turned away, trying to steady my breath. Emma had returned, but even as she walked in, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed between Mark and me. His words, his gaze, were still hanging in the air. I didn't know what to do, and deep down, I knew things would never be the same. I tried to act normal as Emma entered, but I could feel Mark's eyes on me. Even when he turned away, returning to his usual composed self, the tension between us was undeniable. I told myself it was nothing, just a fleeting moment. Maybe I was overthinking it. After all, he was married to my daughter, and that should have made him off-limits. But every time I looked at him, my heart skipped a beat. I could still feel the weight of his gaze, and I saw the way he glanced at me when he thought no one was looking. The days that followed felt heavier. Emma was busy with work, and I found myself alone with Mark more than I cared to admit. Each interaction felt charged, like something was building beneath the surface, ready to explode. But nothing happened. At least, that's what I told myself. One afternoon, while I was getting ready to go to the grocery store, I saw Mark working in the garden. His shirt was soaked with sweat, his muscles flexing as he trimmed the hedges. I stood by the window for a moment, watching him. There was something magnetic about the way his body moved. My heart started racing again, and I quickly turned away, trying to shake the thoughts from my head. But later that day, something unexpected happened. The days after that encounter felt like an eternity. Every time I saw Mark, the tension between us felt almost tangible. Every glance, every word seemed loaded. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was waiting for me to make a move. But I wasn't sure I could. My mind kept telling me it was wrong. He was my son-in-law. But my body, my heart, betrayed me at every turn. One evening, Emma went out with friends, and for once, I had some time to myself. The house was quiet, and the silence made everything feel heavier. I sat on the couch, my mind replaying the moment Mark had touched my arm, the way he had looked at me like I was the only one in the room. That thought made my heart race again. I tried to distract myself by flipping through a magazine, but I couldn't focus. Then I heard a soft knock on the door. My heart skipped a beat. I stood up slowly, hesitating for a moment, before going to answer. The air felt charged, like something was about to happen. When I opened the door, there he was, Mark, standing on the other side, looking almost too calm, but with something dangerous in his eyes. "Clara," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Can we talk?" I froze for a moment. I should have said no, told him this was too much, that I couldn't handle it. But instead, I found myself stepping aside to let him in. What was happening to me? His presence filled the space, and a knot tightened in my stomach the moment he crossed the threshold. It felt like everything else faded away. The silence of the house was deafening, and the air between us crackled with unspoken words. "Mark," I started, my voice shaky, but he cut me off before I could finish. "Clara, please," Mark said, turning to face me, his eyes full of intensity, almost pleading. "I can't stop thinking about what happened. You feel it too, don't you?" I wanted to lie, to tell him that it was all in his head, that I didn't feel anything, but the truth was I did. The way he looked at me, how his presence seemed to invade my thoughts, there was no denying it. "I don't know what you mean," I whispered, barely above a breath. I could feel the heat rising in my face, my words sounding weak, even to me. He took a step closer, and my heart started to race. "Yes, you do. You know exactly what I mean. There's something between us, Clara. I can't explain it, but it's there, and I know you feel it too." I opened my mouth to protest, but no words came out. The space between us was shrinking, and every instinct screamed for me to stop him, but I couldn't move. My body felt frozen in place, my heart pounding in my chest. "Mark," I whispered again, my voice tinged with uncertainty. I wasn't sure what I wanted to say, or even how I felt anymore. His hand reached out, hesitating for a second before gently cupping my cheek. The warmth of his touch flooded through me, and I found myself leaning into it without thinking. His thumb lightly brushed across my skin, and in that instant, everything seemed surreal. "I'm not trying to make you uncomfortable," he said quietly, his face so close to mine now. I can't ignore this anymore." His words hung in the air, thick with meaning. My breath caught in my throat as I met his gaze, and for the first time, I saw the hunger in his eyes, the same hunger that had been simmering beneath the surface the whole time. Just as I thought he was going to kiss me, the door slammed open behind us. "Emma?" I pulled away from Mark instinctively, my heart nearly stopping. My daughter stood in the doorway, her eyes wide with shock and confusion. She looked between me and Mark, her face a mixture of disbelief and hurt. "Mom, Mark, what's going on?" she asked, her voice shaky and barely audible. I could hear the pain in her tone. Mark stepped back quickly, and I saw panic flash across his face. But Emma didn't let him finish. She turned and rushed out of the room, her footsteps echoing down the hall. I stood frozen, the weight of what had just happened crashing down on me like a tidal wave. I stood there for a long moment, trying to process it all. Mark looked at me, his expression torn, conflicted between guilt and desire. "I never meant for this to happen," he said quietly, his voice full of regret. "But it's like, I can't stop wanting you, Clara, and I think you feel it too." I opened my mouth to say something, but the words didn't come. I wanted to tell him to leave, to never come back, but a part of me didn't want him to go. The other part of me, one I couldn't control, wanted more of whatever this was. I wanted to know what would happen next. But just as I was about to speak, I heard Emma's voice from the other room. "I need to talk to you, Mom." I glanced at Mark, who gave me a tight nod before turning quickly toward the door. He left, leaving me standing there in the silence. I had no idea what was coming, but deep down, I knew I couldn't run from this feeling anymore. Things had already changed, and I wasn't sure if I could turn back. I stood frozen, my mind spinning, as Emma's voice echoed in my ears. The reality of what had just happened hit me hard. How close Mark had been, the way his touch had lingered on my skin. I quickly composed myself, rushing to catch up with Emma. My heart raced, my hands trembling as I gripped the doorknob. When I found her in the living room, she was pacing, clearly upset. The look in her eyes, hurt, confusion, and something else I couldn't place, made my stomach drop. "Mom, what was that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as if she couldn't quite believe what she had seen. I opened my mouth, but no words came. What could I say? How could I explain that a part of me didn't want Mark to leave? That his gaze, his touch, made me feel something I hadn't felt in years? Instead, I said the first thing that came to my mind. "Emma, it's not what you think. Mark was just." She interrupted, turning to face me, eyes narrowing.
"He was standing too close to you, Mom."
That wasn't just normal. I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks. Was it so obvious? Was I that transparent? Was Emma picking up on something that I didn't want to admit to myself? "Emma, listen." I started trying to find the right words. "We were just talking, that's all. I don't know what you think you saw, but it's not." Before I could finish, there was a soft knock on the door again. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. I knew exactly who it was before I even opened the door. "Clara," Mark's voice came through. I turned back to Emma, who looked at me, her face full of suspicion. She didn't say anything, but I could see the conflict in her eyes. I quickly walked toward the door, my heart pounding in my chest. When I opened it, Mark stood there, looking unnervingly calm. His eyes flicked over my shoulder briefly, meeting Emma's gaze before returning to mine. There was an apologetic look in his eyes, but also something else, a lingering spark, something that hadn't faded. "Clara, can we talk?" he asked quietly. I glanced at Emma, still standing in the living room, arms crossed, watching us. My heart raced. Mark didn't seem to care about the tension in the room. He was determined to have a conversation. I wasn't sure what to say, but my body acted on its own. "Sure," I said, stepping aside and letting Mark in. I caught Emma's eyes briefly. There was no hiding it now, no pretending everything was fine. Her eyes flashed with hurt before she turned and walked out of the room. Mark stepped inside, his presence filling the space in the most unsettling way. I closed the door behind him, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us was thick with all the unspoken things. Mark stood there, looking at me with those deep, intense eyes. I could feel the heat of his gaze on my skin. I wanted to say something, anything, to break the tension, but my throat was dry. "I didn't mean to upset her," Mark said after a long pause, his voice quiet. "I didn't think she'd walk in at that moment." I nodded, though part of me didn't know what to say. Part of me didn't know how to explain that the moment had felt inevitable, that there was this pull between us, something neither of us could ignore. "I know," I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. "But we need to be careful, Mark. Emma, she's my daughter." His eyes softened, and he took a step closer. "I don't want to hurt anyone, Clara, but this feeling, it's stronger than both of us. Don't you feel it?" My heart pounded in my chest. I couldn't deny the truth in his words. I did feel it. It was like a constant hum beneath everything else, always there. The pull between us was undeniable. It was like a quiet force, subtle yet powerful, that I couldn't escape. Every time Mark was near, my thoughts were consumed by him. The way he moved, the way his voice lingered in the air, it all felt dangerously captivating. "I can't keep pretending this isn't happening," Mark said, his voice low and almost desperate. "You know it too, don't you? We both feel it." His words hung there, thick with unspoken tension, charged with emotions we'd both kept buried. My heart started pounding as I met his eyes, unable to look away. For just a moment, everything else around us faded. It was just us standing there in that room, and all I could feel was the electric pull between us. I don't know what to say," I whispered, my pulse quickening. "I've never felt anything like this before, but it's like something's drawing me to you." And I'm scared of what that means. Mark took another step closer, his breath warm on my ear as he whispered softly, "Don't be afraid, Clara. Let's just see where this leads. We don't have to act on it, but we can't ignore it either." Before I could respond, a familiar sound shattered the moment. Footsteps from down the hall. Emma's voice called out sharply, her tone more insistent this time. "Mom, are you and Mark still talking?" Mark immediately stepped back, as if he'd been burned, and the energy between us evaporated instantly. I blinked, trying to regain my composure, my head spinning. "Yeah," I called back, trying to steady my voice. "We're fine." Mark gave me one last look, his face unreadable. He didn't say a word, but I could tell he was still wrestling with the same inner conflict that I was. After a final glance, he turned and walked toward the door. As he stepped out, a strange emptiness settled in my chest, like something that had just begun to blossom was already fading. "Clara," he said softly, just before the door clicked shut. I stood there, staring at the empty space where he had been, my heart still racing. What was I doing? What was happening to me? I needed to pull myself together, but the pull toward him felt stronger than ever, and I knew deep down this wasn't the last time we'd be alone. But what would happen next? The sound of the door clicking shut behind Mark didn't comfort me. In fact, it seemed to amplify the silence in the room, pressing down on me with all that had just transpired. I leaned against the wall, trying to calm my breath, but my heart refused to slow down. "Mom, are you okay?" Emma's voice came from the hallway, cutting through my thoughts. I tried to steady myself, but I knew there was no way to hide the tension. Not from Emma. She could always read me too well. "Yeah, I'm fine," I said, my voice betraying me with a slight tremor. Mark just wanted to clear things up. It's nothing to worry about. But Emma's expression when I walked into the living room told me she wasn't convinced. Her eyes were narrowed, full of suspicion, and I could see the confusion and hurt written on her face. She crossed her arms, staring at me like she was trying to figure out a puzzle she couldn't solve. "Mom, I don't know what's going on between you and Mark, but I don't like it," Emma said finally, her voice low and firm. "You need to be careful. This isn't like him. He's not that kind of person." Her words cut through the air, and I felt a sharp pang of guilt. She was right in a way. Mark wasn't like that, not in the way I was starting to think about him. But there was something undeniable between us now, and I couldn't pretend it wasn't there. "Emma, you don't get it," I started, but before I could finish, there was another knock at the door. I froze. I didn't have to guess who it was this time. I quickly glanced at Emma, who raised an eyebrow, still watching me with that mix of confusion and concern. The knock came again, louder and more insistent. I couldn't avoid it. I couldn't pretend anymore. I opened the door, and there he was, Mark. His eyes met mine with that same look, like he knew exactly what I was thinking. He didn't speak immediately. He just stood there, and the tension between us was almost palpable. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, as if the question had been building up inside me for days. Before Mark could answer, Emma's voice broke through again. "Mark, what are you doing here?" she asked, her tone sharp and demanding. Mark turned to face her, and for a split second, I saw a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. But then he straightened up, looked Emma dead in the eye, and replied, "I just wanted to talk. It's important. Your mother and we need to figure this out." I swallowed hard, my heart pounding again. The truth was, I had no idea what we were trying to figure out. But when Mark was near, everything else seemed to fade. The guilt, the confusion, all of it just disappeared. Emma gave me a look I couldn't quite decipher. Hurt, frustration, and something else too. She seemed torn, like she didn't want to hear what was happening, but couldn't pull herself away from it. "I don't know what's going on," Emma said, her voice trembling slightly. "But I don't like it. I don't like the way things feel when he's around. Mom, it's not right." The air in the room seemed to freeze. I felt paralyzed, like I couldn't breathe. I opened my mouth to explain, but the words wouldn't come. What could I say? How could I explain that everything was spiraling, that I was just as confused as she was? I looked at Mark, hoping to read something in his expression, but he wasn't looking at me anymore. His gaze was fixed on Emma, and there was something about it, something cold and calculating, that made my stomach twist. It unsettled me. "You don't have to like it," Mark said, his voice now more serious, cutting through the tension. "But your mother and I have things we need to figure out, and I'm not going anywhere." I felt my heart race at his words. Was he serious? Was he really pushing this?
Was I?
Before I could say anything, Emma stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. The sound of it echoed through the silence, and I turned back to face Mark. His expression had softened, but there was still an edge to it, a silent promise that this wasn't over. "I told you, Clara," he said softly, his voice just above a whisper. "We're in this together. There's no turning back." His words, the way he said my name, it was like a magnet drawing me in. I had to fight to keep myself steady. I couldn't let this spiral any further. "Mark, we need to talk," I said, my voice firm, despite the turmoil inside. "We can't keep doing this. We have to figure out where this is going before it's too late." He stepped closer again, his eyes locking onto mine with that same intensity. "I already know where it's going," he said quietly, "and I think you do too." I swallowed hard, my body betraying me as the pull toward him grew even stronger. This wasn't just about us anymore, it was about everything that had changed. And deep down, we both knew things would never be the same.